Super Mario Bros., Wii Sports, Super Mario World, Tetris, Donkey Kong, Altered Beast, Pole Position 2, Keith Courage and Alpha Zones. What do all these games have in common? Well, they were all pack-in titles for their respective consoles back when they were first launched. See, kids, back in the day, whenever a new video game machine was released, they would usually bundle it with a free game, and that free game would be the newcomer's introduction to the system, their first impression, if you will. A good pack-in title would serve as a good introduction to the console, and possibly be a great game in its own right. A great pack-in title would be instrumental in moving units, and essentially become a killer app of sorts. At worst, a pack-in title should be good enough to hold you over until you came across something better for the system. And then there's Keith Courage in Alpha Zones, a game included as a pack-in title for the Turbografx-16 when it was first released back in 1989. Coincidentally, it was also the game that came with the console when I bought it a few years back, and it wasn't long before I eventually invested in a Turbo EverDrive full of games to call my own and never looked back. Hey, TurboGrafx games aren't cheap, kids, and money doesn't grow on trees or hide out in golden boxes. If they did, I would have gotten my hands on one of those PC Engine mini console things if they weren't so goddamn expensive, Jesus Christ. Keith Courage in Alpha Zones places you in the role of the eponymous Keith Courage, a member of the Nations of International Citizens for Earth, or NICE, who is charged with the mission of saving the world from the evil, beastly alien dudes, or BAD. Somewhere along the way, Mr. Courage will encounter members of the Legion Against Menacing Elephants, or LAME, and try to remember why he only got one game while video game mascots got more. I may or may not have made that last point up. Anyways, it's a side-scrolling platformer, obviously, an action game that has you fighting through 7 alpha zones of varying themes, of each of which are divided into 2 segments, an overworld and an underworld, we'll call them. The overworld is where you begin, guiding Keith across the land as he slowly plods along, hopping tiny platforms, some of which move, and killing rapidly spawning enemies, some of which will drop coins. These coins can be subsequently spent on things like sword upgrades and bolt bombs for the underworld segments, as well as some outrageously expensive healing from Nurse Nancy. Yeah, 400 coins? Get the fuck at it, what a ripoff. And contrary to what some would believe, it's not even that kind of healing. I will leave that open to interpretation and move on. Coins also fuel your continues because Keith Courage starts off with 3 hearts, which serve as your health meter, and it takes a few hits for Keith to lose 1 heart. However, if your health runs out or you fall into a bed of glowing red spikes that follow the Mega Man 1 rule of killing you regardless of invincibility frames, thanks for that, then it is a game over because Keith Courage only has 1 life. You can continue, but doing so will strip you of half your bolt bombs and coinage. The latter being particularly painful because as you progress through the game, sword upgrades get progressively more expensive, and you'll need to grind for coinage in order to afford those upgrades. As a helpful tip, standing in certain spots will cause enemies to respawn immediately after killing them. The only good thing is that enemies in the overworlds die with 1 blow, so it's fairly easy to grind for coins quickly, but naturally not quick enough, all things considered. At the end of each overworld segment, there is a hut where, if Keith stands on it, a rainbow will transform him into the awesome Nova suit, according to Wikipedia, might be in the manual too, don't care to check, before sending him to the underworld, which is the latter part of the alpha zones that you traverse. The Nova suit makes use of whatever upgrades you've attained in the overworlds, longer swords as well as bolt bombs, which is ammunition for whatever projectile weapon you've acquired in the field. Enemies in the underworld are much more intense, they move faster, they hit harder, but fortunately you're much quicker. Your main goal here is to make your way down to the boss lair, which is done by navigating your way down a black void. Once you reach the boss, kill it and move on to the next zone, lather, rinse, repeat, for 6 more stages and what have you. Keith Courage is a game that is interesting on paper, but the execution doesn't quite stick the landing. There's an idea that it's trying to go for, but more often than not, feels like the developers were just tossing shit to a wall and seeing what sticks. I get less of this feeling in the overworld because those segments are much more straightforward, even with the grind and shop mechanics. Keith himself is an underwhelming hero. He's slow, plodding, his jumps are somewhat awkward, and while the game has upgrades, you don't benefit from them until you're in your Nova suit in the underworld segments. The level design here follows a similar premise, with some tweaks in color and terrain to differentiate the zones, with special mention of the fire zone and its damaging floors that the game forces you to traverse and take damage, and it that's stupid. Fortunately, Nurse Nancy and her overinflated healing services are there to soothe your wounds at the cost of your wallet because again, 400 coins is a fucking ripoff for what little she does. Again, I will leave that to the imagination and move on. The underworld segments have their share of problems. Sure, you're in your fancy Nova suit and this fucker moves quickly, which makes him much more slippery in control, and slippery controls is not something you want in a game with an emphasis on platforming and trying not to get impaled on glowing red things, which is a tall order, even without all the constantly spawning enemies that are just tossed on there with no rhyme or reason, hence the whole tossing shit to a wall and seeing what sticks mentality I get with these segments. Also, you're making your way downwards, and that means having to make many leaps of faith, especially in the later levels, where they try to make these levels as maze-like, and considering the terrain looks as barren as it does, and on top of that, bonking your head on the ceiling while airborne apparently kills all momentum, and that usually means bad things. The only positive is that there are more pickups. Enemies will sometimes drop hearts, and some of these hearts will extend your health meter. Not sure how this works precisely, nor do I really care. And there are different types of bolt bomb projectile pickups that will launch multiple projectiles at a time, which helps sometimes, and other times I just forget about them, and they only pop up because I might have pressed up while attacking. Because bolt bombs are used in the same way sub-weapons are used in the old school Castlevanias. Press up and attack and whatever. Keith Courage has a bunch of issues that irk me, but I wouldn't go so far as to call it an outright terrible game. It is still somewhat playable, there's an idea or two that's interesting on paper at least, and while control isn't the greatest on either side of the coin, at the very least it is responsive. It's just too bad that the coin that Keith Courage has one side that is slow and dull, and another that is haphazard and tossed together quickly, which probably means the same thing, but whatever. Just go with it, I don't care anymore. For what it's worth, Keith Courage isn't a bad-looking game. You have some colorful sprites and some basic-looking scenery that looks decent, at least. Some of the boss monsters look pretty neat, and the characters in the shops are kind of cute-looking. It's okay-looking at best. I mean, in terms of showcasing the prowess of the Turbografx-16, because this was originally a pack-in title for the system, this is perhaps a poor example because it's just average-looking. It's like it's nothing special. And the same could be said for the sound, which is also decidedly average. Sound effects are stock PC Engine quality synth sound effects that are stock sounding and stock. The soundtrack has a limited number of tracks and they're also decidedly bland sounding, forgettable, and also at times very scratchy. I like me some quality synth music, but I can't seem to find any here, so yeah, sorry, this doesn't do much for me in an audio-video sense. Overall, Keith Courage in Alpha Zones is somewhat mediocre fare. As a pack-in title for the system, this was probably enough to hold you over until you bought more worthwhile TurboGrafx games, but ultimately this is a playable yet utterly forgettable side-scrolling game. Maybe they should have included Bonk's Adventure or something, or pack in one of the better shooters available for the system. Then it probably would have fared better back in the day. Oh well.